The first rule of survival at Galactic Military Academy's Sector Station Omega-5 was simple. Don't draw attention to yourself. The second rule? Well, nobody had bothered writing a second rule because most recruits were too busy trying not to wash out during the first week to worry about advanced strategy. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Lieutenant Joe Fletcher, scratch that, just Joe now, since surnames apparently made the alien instructors break out in linguistic hives, had somehow managed to ignore both rules spectacularly. Not intentionally, mind you. She'd simply shown up, human-shaped and stubborn, which was apparently enough to paint a target on her back the size of a small moon. The training facility stretched out like a metallic nightmare, all sharp angles and unforgiving surfaces that seemed designed by someone who'd clearly never heard of the concept ergonomic design. The walls hummed with that particular frequency that made your teeth itch, and the artificial gravity felt just heavy enough to remind you that you weren't home anymore, wherever home used to be. Gunnery Sergeant Mordak stood at the center of the main drill floor, all 8 feet of reptilian muscle, and barely contained contempt. His scales caught the harsh overhead lighting in a way that made him look like he'd been carved from jade-colored granite, and his eyes, those cold, amber things, swept across the assembled recruits with the enthusiasm of someone examining week-old food scraps. The mixed species squad stood at attention, or what passed for attention when you had beings whose anatomies ranged from vaguely humanoid to did someone let a geometric fever dream join the military? There was Veltar, whose chitinous exoskeleton gleamed with nervous perspiration, or whatever it was that insectoids secreted when they were terrified. Gorma towered over most of the group, her ursine features set in that carefully neutral expression that large beings perfected when they wanted to avoid being volunteered for unpleasant tasks. And then there was Wisp, whose translucent, energy-based form flickered like a candle in a breeze, probably calculating the exact probability of surviving the next hour. Well, 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 Mordak's voice carried across the drill floor with all the warmth of a funeral dirge. Look what the recruitment office dragged in. A human. He pronounced the word like it tasted bad, which, given what Joe had heard about Saurian dietary preferences, might actually be accurate. Joe kept her eyes forward, her posture rigid. She'd learned early in her military career that responding to obvious bait was like feeding wild animals. It only encouraged worse behavior later. I suppose, Mordak continued, beginning his slow prowl around the formation, you all think you're special. Elite candidates for the Galactic Defense Corps. The finest warriors your species have to offer. His gaze lingered on Joe with particular distaste. Some of you might even believe the propaganda about cross-species, cooperation, and unity in diversity. The recruits remained silent, but Joe could feel the tension radiating from her fellow cadets like heat from a badly tuned reactor core. This wasn't going to be a standard welcome speech. Today, Mordak announced, stopping directly in front of Joe, we are going to conduct a little experiment in reality. You see, Command seems to think that mixing species in elite units creates some kind of synergy. He spat the word like a curse. But I've seen combat, Cubs. I've watched good soldiers die because someone couldn't keep up. Because someone wasn't strong enough, fast enough, tough enough when it mattered. Joe felt her jaw tighten, but she maintained her composure. Around her, the other recruits shifted uncomfortably. Even Wisp's usually steady glow seemed to dim slightly. So, here's what we're going to do, Mordak said, his voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow felt more threatening than his earlier bellowing. We're going to test the weakest link. His amber eyes fixed on Joe with predatory focus. Step forward, human. The silence that followed could have been cut with a plasma torch. Joe moved forward one precise step, her boots clicking against the metal flooring with military precision. The Gauntlet Endurance Course. Mordak gestured toward a section of the drill floor that Joe hadn't noticed before, probably because her brain had been trying to protect her sanity by ignoring obviously dangerous things. 60-pound pack, rough terrain simulation, obstacle course, and a 20-minute time limit. Most recruits attempt this in week 5 of training. Most fail. Joe glanced at the course setup and felt her stomach perform an impressive gymnastics routine. It looked like someone had taken a standard military obstacle course and then asked a sadistic engineer to make it worse. Much worse. Of course, Mordak continued with something that might have been a smile if smiles were supposed to look like threats. Most recruits aren't trying to prove that their entire species deserves a place in elite units. Most recruits aren't trying to demonstrate that physical and psychological limitations are just, what do you humans call them? Mindsets to overcome? The other cadets were staring now, and Joe could practically hear their thoughts. The insectoid Veltar's compound eyes reflected her image in dozens of tiny facets, each one probably calculating her chances of survival. Gorma's massive form remained still, but her small, intelligent eyes tracked every micro-expression on Joe's face. Even Wisp had solidified enough to focus completely on the unfolding drama. "Here's the beautiful part," Mordak said, warming to his theme like a performer who'd found his rhythm. "When you fail, and you will fail, because this course is designed to break beings with twice your muscle mass and 3 times your cardiovascular capacity, your squad mates here will understand exactly what kind of liability they'd be carrying in actual combat." Joe felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the feeling you get when someone explains that they've fundamentally misunderstood who you are and what you're capable of. It was the same feeling she'd had when her academy instructors on Earth had suggested she might want to consider a support role instead of frontline combat training. 60 pounds, she said quietly. "Excuse me?" Mordak leaned forward, his scaled features shifting into an expression of mock concern. "The pack. 60 pounds. Is that Earth standard or local gravity equivalent?" Joe's voice remained level, professional. Around her, she could sense the other recruit's surprise at her calm response. Mordak's smile widened, showing far too many sharp teeth. "Local gravity equivalent. Though I suppose I could adjust it to Earth standard, if you think that would make things easier." "No adjustment necessary, Sergeant." Joe met his gaze directly. "When do I start?" The silence stretched for several heartbeats. In the background, the station's life support systems hummed with mechanical indifference to the drama playing out on the drill floor. Somewhere in the distance, another training squad was running formation drills, their synchronized footfalls echoing through the corridors like a military heartbeat. "Confident," Mordak mused, though his tone suggested he found confidence in humans about as appealing as finding insects in his rations. "I like that. It makes the fall so much more educational." He gestured toward the equipment station, where a regulation pack sat waiting with the kind of ominous presence usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. "Suit up, human. Let's see what your species is really made of." As Joe moved toward the equipment station, she caught a glimpse of her fellow recruits' faces. Veltar's antennae twitched with what looked like nervous anticipation. Gorma's expression had shifted to something that might have been sympathy, or possibly the look bears gave prey they felt sorry for, but were going to eat anyway. Wisp's energy form flickered more rapidly, which Joe had learned was their equivalent of agitation. None of them expected her to succeed. Hell, she wasn't entirely sure she expected to succeed, but as she hefted the pack and felt its weight settle across her shoulders like a familiar burden, something in her chest began to burn with that particular fire that had gotten her through military academy, through advanced training, and through every challenge that had tried to break her down to prove a point. Mordak wanted to use her failure as a teaching moment? Fine. But he might want to be careful about what lesson he was actually teaching. The pack settled into place with the weight of expectation and the promise of pain. Joe adjusted the straps with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise. Around her, the training facility seemed to hold its breath. "Ready when you are, Sergeant," she said. Mordak's chronometer beeped with the cheerful enthusiasm of a device that had no idea it was about to witness either triumph or spectacular failure. 20 minutes, he announced to the assembled squad. Starting now. Joe launched forward into the course like she'd been shot from a railgun, and immediately understood why most recruits waited until week 5. The first obstacle was a series of barriers that required a combination of climbing, crawling, and what could generously be called controlled falling. With 60 pounds of pack weight throwing off her center of gravity, each movement became a careful negotiation between physics and stubbornness. Behind her, she could hear Mordak's commentary for the benefit of the watching cadets. Notice how the human's smaller frame works against her here. Insufficient leverage. Poor strength-to-weight ratio, even without the pack. Joe gritted her teeth and hauled herself over a barrier that felt like it had been designed by someone who thought regular barriers weren't quite insulting enough. The pack shifted, trying to drag her sideways, and she adjusted her grip with the kind of automatic response that came from years of training in environments that didn't care about your feelings. The thing was, Mordak wasn't entirely wrong about human limitations. Joe knew the statistics. Humans weren't the strongest species, weren't the fastest, weren't the most naturally resilient. On paper, they were decidedly average in almost every measurable category. What the statistics didn't capture, what you couldn't really quantify in neat little data points, was the sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit that seemed hardwired into human DNA. Her father had called it stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. Her first drill instructor on Earth had called it pathologically incapable of knowing when to give up. Joe preferred to think of it as tactical inflexibility regarding surrender. The terrain simulation kicked in as she reached the second section, and suddenly the metal flooring beneath her feet shifted to mimic loose gravel on a steep incline. Her boots slipped, the pack weight nearly sending her tumbling backward, and she heard one of the cadets, probably Veltar, make a small sound that might have been sympathy, or might have been the insectoid equivalent of oops. Joe caught herself, planted her feet, and kept moving. The pack felt heavier now, or maybe that was just her imagination playing tricks. Either way, she'd carried heavier loads through worse terrain. There had been that training exercise in Earth's Australian outback, where the temperature had hit 45 degrees Celsius, and the instructor had cheerfully informed them that water breaks were for people who planned ahead better. There had been the mountain warfare course in the Rockies, where they'd carried full gear through snow that came up to her waist and wind that felt like nature's way of asking if you were really sure about your life choices. This was just another day at the office, a really unpleasant, potentially career-ending day at the office, but still. Interesting, she heard Mordak say, his voice carrying the tone of someone making clinical observations. The human isn't slowing down as much as projected. Of course, adrenaline can mask fatigue temporarily. The crash comes later. Joe hit the third obstacle, a series of rope climbs interspersed with crawls through narrow tunnels that seemed designed to test both claustrophobia and upper body strength simultaneously. The pack made the tunnels even tighter, and she had to control her breathing to avoid the kind of panic that would waste precious oxygen and energy. Breathe in. Move forward. Breathe out. Ignore the way the walls seem to press closer. Ignore the weight trying to drag her backward. Ignore the voice in her head that was starting to suggest that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't such a good idea after all. As she emerged from the final tunnel, she caught sight of the watching cadets. Veltar's antennae were practically vibrating with nervous energy. Gorma had moved closer to the course boundary, her massive form tense with what looked like anticipation. Even Wisp seemed more solid than usual, their energy form focused with laser intensity on Joe's progress. They were rooting for her. The realization hit her with surprising force. These aliens, beings from species she'd never even heard of 6 months ago, were actually hoping she'd succeed. Not because they particularly cared about her, probably, but because her failure would confirm something ugly about the universe, something about limitations and hierarchies, and who deserved to be where. Well then, time to disappoint some prejudices. The fourth section was pure endurance, a flat sprint across terrain that shifted unpredictably between surfaces designed to mimic everything from swampland to loose sand to rocky scree. Joe settled into the rhythm she'd learned during her first marathon, back when she'd been 19 and stupid enough to think that running 26 miles sounded like fun. Pace yourself. Don't fight the terrain. Work with it. Save the real effort for when you need it most. And always, always remember that the finish line is just another step that happens to be the last one. Her breathing settled into the steady pattern that meant her body had accepted this as the new normal. Not comfortable, certainly not easy, but manageable, sustainable. The pack weight had become part of her now, integrated into her movement patterns like an ungainly but familiar dance partner. 15 minutes remaining, Mordak announced, and Joe could hear something new in his voice. Not quite surprise, but maybe the absence of the smug certainty that had colored his earlier commentary. The fifth obstacle was a climbing wall that stretched up into the training facility's upper levels, followed by a rappel down the other side. Joe looked up at the handholds, clearly designed for beings with longer reach and greater upper body strength, and felt that familiar fire in her chest burn a little brighter. Her father used to tell her that humans had one evolutionary advantage that most species lacked. They were too stupid to know when something was impossible. He'd meant it as a joke, but Joe had always suspected there was more truth in it than he'd realized. She started climbing. The pack tried to drag her away from the wall with every upward movement. Her shoulders burned. Her forearms screamed protests that her brain politely ignored. Somewhere around the halfway point, her body started suggesting that this might be a good time to reconsider her life choices, possibly while lying down somewhere comfortable. Joe kept climbing. Below her, she could hear the cadets talking in hushed voices. Veltar's chittering commentary was too rapid for her universal translator to catch, but his tone sounded increasingly excited. Gorma's deeper voice rumbled something that might have been encouragement. Wisp's communication came as brief flashes of colored light that somehow conveyed more emotion than most species managed with actual words. 10 minutes, Mordak called out, and now there was definitely something different in his voice. Uncertainty, maybe. Or possibly the first stirrings of the realization that his object lesson wasn't going according to plan. Joe reached the top of the wall and took a precious few seconds to look down at the rappel route. It was steep, probably steeper than regulation safety standards would normally allow, and the landing zone looked about as forgiving as Mordak's personality. But she'd done worse. Maybe not with 60 pounds of pack, and maybe not when failure would prove a point about her entire species' worthiness, but worse nonetheless. She clipped into the rappel line and stepped backward off the platform. The descent was controlled falling with delusions of grandeur, and the pack weight made every movement a negotiation between gravity and technique. But as her boots touched the landing zone and she unclipped from the line, Joe felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite confidence, that would be premature, but something like momentum. Like the feeling you get when you realize that the thing trying to break you is going to have to work a lot harder than it expected. 6 minutes remaining. Mordak's voice carried across the training floor, and Joe could swear she heard a note of something that might have been respect creeping in around the edges. The final obstacle was pure evil disguised as a training exercise. A maze of barriers, crawls, and climbs that had to be navigated in sequence, with no room for error and no shortcuts. Joe looked at it and felt her lips curve into something that probably qualified as a smile, if smiles were supposed to look slightly unhinged. This was where it got interesting. She moved into the maze with the steady determination of someone who had long since passed the point where quitting was an option. The pack weight, the burning muscles, the voice in her head suggesting that maybe she'd proven enough already. All of it faded into background noise. Behind her, she could hear the cadets shouting encouragement now, their voices creating a multilingual chorus of support that somehow made the next handholds easier to find, the next barrier easier to clear. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the sound of her own breathing and the cadets cheering, she could hear Mordak muttering something that sounded suspiciously like impossible. Joe smiled and kept moving. After all, impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. 3 minutes left on the chronometer, and Joe was still moving. Not gracefully, not easily, but moving with the relentless inevitability of a geological process. Mordak stared at the human navigating his carefully designed nightmare course and felt something uncomfortable twist in his gut, something that might have been the first stirrings of professional respect, or possibly just indigestion from the morning's nutrient paste. "This is unprecedented," he muttered to himself, then realized he'd spoken loud enough for the cadets to hear. Veltar's compound eyes swiveled toward him with the kind of intensity usually reserved for spotting predators, and Gorma made a sound that was definitely the Ursine equivalent of "told you so." Joe hit the final section of the maze, a series of obstacles that required her to army crawl under barriers barely 18 inches high, then immediately transition to overhead monkey bars that stretched across a gap designed to test grip strength and pure stubbornness in equal measure. The pack scraped against every surface, caught on every protrusion, and generally behaved like it had been specifically programmed to make her life as difficult as possible. She kept moving anyway. 2 minutes, Mordak called out, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word. Around him, the squad had moved closer to the course boundaries, pressed against the safety barriers like spectators at some kind of sporting event, which, Joe supposed, this had become. The question was whether it was a triumph or a tragedy in progress. The monkey bars felt like they'd been designed by someone who thought regular monkey bars weren't quite sadistic enough. Each handhold was just far enough apart to require a full stretch, just slippery enough to demand perfect grip strength, and positioned at just the right height to make the pack weight work against her with maximum efficiency. Joe's shoulders screamed. Her forearms had moved past pain into some kind of transcendent state, where agony became background music. She swung hand over hand across the gap, her boots dangling free, the pack trying to twist her spine into interesting new configurations that probably weren't covered in standard anatomy textbooks. Halfway across, her left hand slipped. The collective intake of breath from the watching cadets could have powered a small atmospheric processor. Joe hung for a moment by one hand, pack weight threatening to pull her into a fall that wouldn't just mean failure, it would mean injury, humiliation, and confirmation of every ugly assumption about human limitations that Mordak had been nursing. Instead of falling, Joe did something that made Veltar's antennae stand straight up and caused Wisp to flare into a brief aurora of surprised colors. She swung her legs up, hooked her boots over the bar, and continued across the gap in an improvised hand-over-hand crawl that was probably not regulation technique, but was definitely effective. 90 seconds! Mordak's voice had taken on the tone of someone commentating on something he couldn't quite believe he was seeing. Joe dropped from the bars onto the final platform and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to assess the last obstacle. A rope descent down a sheer wall, followed by a sprint across open ground to the finish marker. Simple in concept, potentially catastrophic in execution, especially with legs that felt like they'd been replaced with oversized noodles, and a pack that had apparently gained weight during the course through some kind of malicious physics. She clipped into the descent line and looked down at the finish marker. 50 meters of open ground. 50 meters between here and proving... What, exactly? That humans could be just as stubborn as any other species? That military training worked regardless of physiology? That Mordak's assumptions about weak links were maybe a little more complicated than he'd thought? 60 seconds remaining. Joe stepped off the platform and rappelled down the wall in a controlled slide that was probably faster than safety regulations would recommend. The pack tried to spin her, tried to slam her into the wall, tried to generally make her reconsider her life choices. She hit the ground with 30 seconds left, and legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The finish marker sat there 50 meters away, looking smug and achievable and impossibly distant all at the same time. Joe took one step toward it, then another. Her body offered several helpful suggestions about lying down right here and accepting that she'd come farther than anyone expected. Her brain politely told her body to shut up and keep moving. 20 seconds. 40 meters to go. The cadets were shouting now, not just encouragement, but actual cheering, a multilingual cacophony of support that somehow made her legs remember how to function. Veltar's chittering had reached frequencies that probably violated noise ordinances. Gorma's roars could have intimidated a small starship. Even Wisp was pulsing with colors that didn't have names in Standard Galactic. 15 seconds. 30 meters. Joe's vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on the finish marker. Everything else, the pain, the weight, the burning in her lungs faded into background static. This was what her instructors on Earth had called the zone, that strange mental state where your body kept functioning long after it should have given up, powered by nothing more than the absolute refusal to quit. 10 seconds. 20 meters. She could see Mordak in her peripheral vision, his scaled features frozen in an expression that might have been shock, or might have been the reptilian equivalent of, "What the hell is happening here?" 5 seconds. 10 meters. The finish marker loomed ahead, like salvation with a convenient timing device attached. Joe's legs moved in a rhythm that had nothing to do with conscious thought, and everything to do with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of pushing past the point where pushing should have been possible. 3 seconds. 5 meters. The pack felt like it weighed nothing and everything simultaneously. A paradox of weight and momentum that defied rational explanation. 2 seconds. 2 meters. Joe could practically taste the finish line, could feel the moment of completion building like static electricity before a storm. 1 second. Joe's hand slapped the finish marker with a sound like a thunderclap, and the chronometer's final beep echoed across the training floor like a verdict from the universe itself. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of life support systems and Joe's ragged breathing. She stood there, swaying slightly, pack still strapped to her shoulders, one hand resting on the finish marker like she was afraid it might try to escape if she let go. Then Veltar started chittering again, but this time the sound was pure excitement, pure joy. The kind of noise you make when you've witnessed something that changes your understanding of what's possible. Gorma's roar shook dust from the overhead fixtures. Wisp blazed with colors that turned the immediate area into a small-scale light show. And Mordak? Mordak stood there, staring at Joe with an expression that suggested his worldview was undergoing some significant renovations. "Time," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the cadets' celebration. Then, louder. 19 minutes, 58 seconds. Course completion within regulation parameters. Joe straightened up, turned around, and looked directly at him. Her face was streaked with sweat, her uniform was torn in 3 places, and she was breathing like someone who'd just finished running from something large and unfriendly. But her eyes were steady, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly calm. "What's next, Sergeant?" The silence that followed could have been measured in geological epochs. Mordak stared at her, his amber eyes reflecting something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Around them, the cadets had gone quiet, sensing that something important was happening, something that would change the dynamic of their training unit in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Finally, Mordak spoke, and his voice carried a note that hadn't been there before, something that sounded suspiciously like respect. "Next," he said slowly, "we find out what else you humans are capable of. And whether your squad mates here have been paying attention." He turned to face the other cadets, his gaze sweeping across Veltar, Gorma, and Wisp with new intensity. "Because if you think that was impressive, wait until you see what happens when the rest of you try to keep up with her." Joe felt something warm spread through her chest. Not just satisfaction, but something deeper. Something that felt like the beginning of true teamwork. She looked at her fellow cadets, saw the new light in their eyes, the way they were looking at her not as a liability or a weak link, but as someone who had just redefined their understanding of what was possible. "Same course?" Veltar asked, his translated voice vibrating with excitement. "Same course," Mordak confirmed. "Same pack weight. Same time limit. Let's see what you've learned." As the cadets began moving toward the equipment station, Joe allowed herself a small smile. This hadn't been about proving human superiority. It had been about proving that assumptions were dangerous things, that writing someone off based on statistics and prejudices was a mistake that could cost you in the field. But mostly, it had been about showing that sometimes the best way to deal with someone trying to break you was to refuse to break. And if that inspired others to push past their own assumed limitations, well, that was just a bonus. The real training, Joe suspected, was just beginning. What happened next would probably violate several regulations about proper training procedures, safe equipment usage, and the inadvisability of allowing impressionable young aliens to attempt feats of endurance that might result in species-wide psychological trauma. But Mordak was beginning to suspect that regulations were more like guidelines anyway, especially when dealing with situations that the regulation writers had never imagined. Veltar was the first to step forward, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming with nervous perspiration, or whatever passed for perspiration in his species. "I'll go next," he announced, his translated voice carrying the kind of determination usually reserved for last stands and marriage proposals. "Veltar," Mordak said slowly, "your species typically excels at precision tasks and technical analysis. Brute force endurance is not exactly your." "Did you just tell me what my species can't do?" Veltar interrupted, his compound eyes reflecting Joe's image in dozens of tiny facets, each one apparently seeing something that inspired confidence rather than caution. Mordak's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. In all his years of training recruits, he'd never had a cadet interrupt him to demand the right to attempt something potentially dangerous. Usually, they were trying to get out of such things. "Pack me up," Veltar continued, moving toward the equipment station with the purposeful stride of someone who had just made a decision that probably wasn't entirely rational, but felt absolutely right. Joe watched this exchange with growing amazement. She'd expected her completion of the course to be a one-time demonstration, a proof of concept that would maybe earn her a little respect and allow the training to continue without constant species-based harassment. She hadn't expected it to spark some kind of motivational revolution among her fellow cadets. Gorma stepped up beside Veltar, her massive ursine frame making the insectoid look even smaller by comparison. "If he's doing it, I'm doing it," she rumbled, her voice carrying the kind of finality usually associated with natural disasters. "Me too," Wisp added, their energy form flickering with colors that Joe was beginning to recognize as excitement mixed with determination. "This looks like fun." Mordak stared at his cadets like they'd all simultaneously developed some kind of collective madness. "This is not a competition," he said, though his voice lacked its usual commanding authority. "This is a punishment exercise designed to demonstrate—" "What?" Joe asked quietly, and something in her tone made everyone turn to look at her. "Designed to demonstrate what, exactly, Sergeant?" The silence stretched like a wire under tension. Mordak's amber eyes met Joe's steady gaze, and for a moment, the training facility might as well have been empty, except for the two of them. "You knew," Mordak said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew about Kepler Station." Joe nodded slowly. "I knew about the evacuation. I knew about the civilian casualties. I knew about the inquiry that concluded the human response team made tactically sound decisions under impossible circumstances. Kepler Station. 3 years ago. A mining operation on the edge of civilized space that had sent out a distress call when their primary life support systems failed. The nearest response unit had been a human naval vessel, and they'd managed to evacuate 60% of the station's population before the structure collapsed completely. The remaining 40%, including several of Mordak's nest siblings, had been lost when a secondary hull breach made further rescue attempts impossible. "Tactically sound," Mordak repeated, and his voice carried the weight of old pain, old anger. "Easy to say when they weren't your family dying in the wreckage." "You're right," Joe said simply. "It is easy to say. Just like it was easy for you to decide that the best way to deal with your grief was to take it out on the next human who came through your training program." The other cadets had gone very still, sensing the undercurrents of something larger than a simple training exercise. Veltar's antennae twitched nervously. Gorma's small eyes darted between Joe and Mordak like she was watching a very slow, very dangerous dance. "But here's the thing, Sergeant," Joe continued, her voice remaining calm and professional despite the emotional minefield she was walking through. "Your family didn't die because humans are weak or inadequate. They died because sometimes, even when everyone does everything right, the universe still breaks your heart. And taking that pain out on me, trying to use me as an object lesson about human limitations, that doesn't honor their memory. It just perpetuates the kind of thinking that gets people killed in the field." Mordak was quiet for a long moment, his scaled features working through emotions that were clearly complicated and deeply personal. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, like words scraped over gravel. "They were good people," he said. "My nest siblings. They deserved better than to die in the dark, waiting for rescue that came too late." "Yes, they did," Joe agreed. "And the best way to honor that is to make sure that the next time someone needs rescuing, their rescuers are as prepared, as trained, and as capable as possible, regardless of species, regardless of perceived limitations." She gestured toward Veltar, Gorma, and Wisp, who were still standing by the equipment station like they were ready to storm the beaches of some hostile shore. These cadets just watched what they thought was impossible. Now they want to find out what else might be possible. You can either help them discover their real capabilities, or you can keep trying to teach them that some people are just naturally inferior. The training facility's life support systems hummed in the background, filling the silence with mechanical breathing. Somewhere in the distance, another squad was running formation drills, their synchronized footfalls echoing like a heartbeat through the corridors. Finally, Mordak straightened to his full height and looked at each of the waiting cadets in turn. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. "Very well," he said. "Veltar, you're up first. Standard pack weight, standard time limit. But if you get hurt attempting this, I'm writing a report that will make your career counselor weep." Veltar's chittering response was probably enthusiasm, though it might have been terror. Either way, he moved toward the pack with the determined gait of someone who had decided that dignity was overrated compared to proving a point. What followed was 20 minutes of the most inspiring, terrifying, and occasionally physics-defying display of determination that the Sector Station Omega-5 training facility had ever witnessed. Veltar's insectoid physiology turned out to be surprisingly well-suited to the climbing portions of the course, though he had to develop creative solutions for the obstacles designed around larger, more humanoid proportions. Gorma's massive strength let her power through sections that had nearly broken Joe, but her size made some of the more confined spaces genuinely challenging. And Wisp approached the entire course like a three-dimensional puzzle, flowing around obstacles in ways that were probably cheating, but were definitely effective. All three cadets finished within the time limit. All three collapsed in exhausted heaps afterward. And all three looked at each other, and then at Joe with the kind of camaraderie that usually took months of shared hardship to develop. "Well," Mordak said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder, "this is highly irregular." "Yes, Sergeant," Joe replied, struggling to keep the smile out of her voice. "Very irregular." Just then, the facility's main entrance chimed with the arrival of someone important enough to make the security systems announce their presence with polite musical tones instead of harsh mechanical beeps. Commander Drax entered the training floor with the purposeful stride of someone who had heard interesting reports and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Drax was old-school military from a species that looked like someone had crossbred a wolf with a strategic planning committee. His scarred features and deliberate movements spoke of decades spent in combat zones, where mistakes were measured in casualty reports rather than performance evaluations. "Sergeant Mordak," Drax said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made junior officers check their uniform buttons reflexively. "I've received some unusual reports about activities in your training section. Something about regulation violations and impossible completion times?" Mordak straightened to attention, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir, the cadets have exceeded expectations in today's endurance assessment." Drax looked at the exhausted but triumphant squad, then at the obstacle course that still bore signs of recent intensive use, then back at Mordak, with the expression of someone who suspected he wasn't getting the complete story. "Exceeded expectations," he repeated slowly. "All of them?" "All of them, sir," Mordak confirmed, and there was something in his voice that might have been pride. "It appears our initial assessments of cadet capabilities may have been conservative." Drax studied the group for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that would escape less seasoned observers. The way the cadets had unconsciously formed a tight formation around Joe. The mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration on their faces. The subtle but significant change in Mordak's posture and tone. "I see," Drax said finally. "And I suppose this newfound excellence in your training section is purely coincidental?" "Sir," Joe said, stepping forward slightly, "permission to speak freely." "Granted." "We learned that assumptions about limitations are often just excuses for not trying hard enough, and that the best way to push past those limitations is to have people around you who refuse to accept that impossible is anything more than a starting point for negotiations." Drax was quiet for a moment, then made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could carry 30 years of military experience and a deep appreciation for the unexpected. "Very well," he said. "Carry on, Sergeant. It seems your training methods are producing results, however unorthodox they might be." As the commander departed, Mordak turned to face his squad, and Joe noticed that he was looking at all of them now, not singling anyone out for special attention or particular skepticism. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we begin advanced team coordination exercises. I have a feeling you're going to surprise me again." Joe looked at her fellow cadets, Veltar with his gleaming exoskeleton, Gorma with her massive, gentle strength, Wisp with their ethereal grace and unexpected determination. They looked back at her with the kind of trust and respect that couldn't be ordered or manufactured, only earned through shared experience and mutual support. This squad was going to be legendary. Joe could feel it in the way they moved together now, the way they looked at challenges as things to be overcome rather than obstacles to be endured. They'd learned something today that no textbook could teach, that the only real limitations were the ones you accepted as final. And in the Galactic Defense Corps, that was the kind of lesson that saved lives and won wars. The training facility hummed around them, ready for whatever came next. And what came next, Joe suspected, was going to be interesting indeed.